Right now, though, let's talk to our first guest of this, former Brexit Secretary, still current Tory MP, David Davis, who joins us now. Good morning to you, David.
Morning.
Morning. Obviously, I want to get on to talking about Brexit with you, of course, as a former Brexit Secretary and the latest developments there. But first up, let's talk about the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. There undoubtedly have been some huge successes from this government in terms of beefing up the NHS capacity, recruiting people, and dealing with the pandemic from a standing start. We are where we are when we start a pandemic, and whether or not you're South Korea or Germany or the UK, you start with what you start with at that moment. We can go back and have the blame game later. But do you think overall that the government did actually focus on one particular aspect of expanding the NHS at the expense of people in care homes, where we've seen what looks like possibly an extra 30,000 deaths over since March, over what we would normally be expecting in this period, and at the expense of people in the community, those suffering from non-coronavirus life-threatening illnesses like cancer or heart disease, and that actually lessons do need to be learned?
Yes, I mean, there's little doubt of that. I mean, in essence, I think the government was probably slightly panicked by the scenes of what was going on in the Italian health service. The Italians have a very good health service, and you may remember it was completely overwhelmed during the peak of the crisis in Italy. And so I think they were probably a bit unnerved by that. They also probably a bit unnerved by Professor Neil Ferguson's forecasts of hundreds of thousands of deaths, and therefore with that, obviously millions of cases. They did a number of things. They went to lockdown, of course, but they also did. I mean, Matthew's mentioned one, but they deterred people from going into hospital. You were told not to go to hospital unless you were feeling very unwell, which of course meant people would arrive late, and they would some of them would have been beyond recall and died. That was the experience that New York showed. Secondly, they triaged people when they got to the hospital. If you had to pass a sort of frailty index. If you were beyond a certain level, you were just basically given palliative care, and that was that. They didn't try to intubate you or whatever, and people may have died from that. As you mentioned, people were discharged early into care homes. Now, Robert Buckland's got a point that they came out of care homes in the first place in many cases. But remember, quite a few of these people actually caught coronavirus in hospital. About 1 in 5 people, it sounds like now, actually caught the coronavirus, either from hospital nurses and doctors or more likely from other patients. So you got that too. So all those things. And then, of course, as you say, the deferral we talk about deferral of elective surgery. Actually, it's deferral of quite serious stuff in some cases. Many of my colleagues and I have got constituency cases of people who had cancer care, which was deferred. And of course, the story is, people know, if you're late to diagnose cancer or late to treat cancer, then that can be a death sentence in its own right. So there are clearly a lot of things arose out of it. And the other thing, I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but the other thing is actually, in many ways, this was done to create spare beds. You empty beds. I mean, you had the most obvious thing was those pictures of the Nightingale hospitals, relatively unused. So in a way, we probably overdid it slightly.
Yeah.
But
perhaps understandable at the time.
Yeah.
The trouble is, of course,
this is the worst crisis any politician since I've been alive, frankly, has ever faced. And it's an unmapped territory. I mean, I know they did sickness and so on, but I wonder how many members of the cabinet, the current cabinet, knew anything about sickness before all this turned into a crisis. I really do. Okay. Maybe the health secretary, but nobody else.
Let's talk about where we are right now, though. We're supposed to have this, testing, tracking, and tracing system up and running by mid-May, ahead of the lockdown easing around now, and then schools going back. We were told again at the earliest by Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, from the 1st of June. So it does seem like the government is possibly going to row back from that date because the likes of the BMA and even some senior advisors to the government are saying, look, you need to have that up and running really for schools to go back safely, because of course you need to be able to test everyone in a school if someone does test positive there. Do you think that basically someone dropped the ball when it came to that, and who's responsible for that? Because there's no reason why, when you're expanding NHS capacity, you can't be recruiting people to work on testing and tracing.
Well, there are two. I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, we were late to testing and tracing, but the important bit of it was testing. I mean, if there was one very, very big wrong decision in all of this, it's right back in January that we didn't say, okay, we're going to need testing. We're going to need it now, and say to Public Health England, no, you can't run it. You're too small an organisation to do this. We've got to put it out to the private sector and anybody who can help, sort of research laboratories and whatever. So testing is the sort of bottleneck in this. The tracking and tracing, they're going to need more. I mean, they've got 20,000 on now. They're probably going to need up to 50,000 trackers and tracers. But let's come back to the schools. The VMA seem to have changed their mind, by the way, overnight, don't they? They've now said it's okay. The way I would address it, and the way I assume a government minister somewhere is addressing this, is I'd look at all the other countries. We've got one advantage in this. We are about 3 weeks behind everybody else, in Europe anyway. So I would be looking at what the other countries in Europe are doing. Some of them have gone back to school. I think the Germans and so on are going back to school. And remember, most of the European countries are not maintaining 2 metre separation. They're maintaining 1 metre separation. So, and that makes a big difference in a classroom. You can get basically 4 times as many in if you have 1 metre separation. And I'd be looking very hard at what Germany, Austria and the other European countries are doing about the return to school and what the consequences are and what the tactics are using. I mean, I heard some people say, well, why don't we put perspex screens up? I mean, it'd make a very odd classroom, but the all sorts of options, and we should be looking at that.
And you say learning their lessons, quite literally. Well,
that's what let's talk about. Enough of. You see, we believe too many of these blasted models, which actually are just guesswork, and we haven't done enough of looking at what other people have done, what have they got right. There are some countries in Europe done a magnificent job, and not ones you'd expect. Latvia, Greece, Cyprus, Malta, and they've been ahead of us. We should have been learning from them all along, and that's what we should be doing now.
Okay, let's also talk about Brexit, of course, how we learn lessons from these previous negotiations with the EU, led by Theresa May and her acolytes. But the chief Brexit negotiator for Boris Johnson, David Frost, he has written a very punchy letter to Michel Barnier, the EU chief negotiator, at the end of the third round of talks, pulling absolutely no punches, publicly accusing Brussels of viewing the UK as unworthy of getting the sort of free trade deal which they've offered many other countries. And Michael Gove has added to it, saying the EU has taken an ideological approach. Are you at this moment in time, on the 20th of May, hopeful, A, that we will actually end the transition period at the end of December this year as planned and is in legislation, and B, that we're going to get a free trade deal starting on the 1st of January?
Yes and yes. Look, David Frost is doing exactly the right thing. There was always going to be a point in this exercise in which there was going to be a crisis moment. That's what negotiations are like, particularly international negotiations, and particularly ones which are so important to all the countries involved. So it was going to happen. What David Frost is doing is highlighting something we started way back in my day as one of the acolytes, by the way. and what we did when I was in the department was we drew up all of the, as it were, like the best of all of the other trade deals that the European Union struck with everybody else. And we basically said, look, you struck this deal with Canada, you struck this deal with Korea, you struck this deal with Australia. We just want the same. So you can't pretend this undermines the viability of the single market if you've already struck deals like this with other people. And that's really, in essence, that's what the Canada plus operation is. That's essentially what the British ask is now. And it's very, very difficult for the Europeans to defeat that logic. And all they can do is say, no, we can't allow this because it undermines the single market, which has, and that's what's meant by an ideological approach. The simple truth is that at some point the Europeans are going to have to face reality. And reality for them is that the whole world economy is now on its back. You would have to be certifiably mad to impose tariffs and quotas under these circumstances. And that, in essence, is the threat for sort of 1st of January. I'm pretty sure that if we don't have a deal on the 31st December, we won't impose tariffs and quotas, if we do, they'll be very, very light ones. And so the first mover would be in this will be the European Union. I don't think it's going to happen. I just don't think it's going to happen. So work back from that. Okay, how's the negotiation going to play out? What's going to happen is that in the next month or so, we're going to say by the June deadline, nope, we are carrying on. The deadline's the same. We're not deferring it. We're not extending it and so on. And that forces the European states, not just the Commission, but the states to say, what do we want out of this? Do we want a trade war in the middle of all this? No, we don't. No, we don't. Okay. We want to carry on as close as we can to what was before. Now, we've left. The British people have said, take back control of our laws and borders and so on. And so the government's got to do that. And the European Union has to wake up to it. And that's what will happen. And that's, you're just seeing the precursor to that. And it will play out. It may be tense, it may be scary in the second part of the year, but we'll get there.